A photo tells a story, but it doesn't often tell the whole story. And what you think is an innocent photo may turn out to be something much, much worse. August 20th, 1975 was a picturesque day for California's Sequoia National Park. Blue skies with the occasional cloud drifting in front of the sun, a moment's reprieve from the blistering heat. But the temperature didn't stop 18-year-old Michael McQuillan and his two siblings, Mary and 12-year-old Sean, from venturing to the top of Morro Rock. The mountain views were postcard-worthy, so Mary readied to take a picture of her brothers when something strange happened. Michael and Sean's hair stood on end as the air charged with electricity. The boys, more amused than alarmed, even took a photo of their sister's hair splayed out above her. Then suddenly hail fell from the skies and the teenagers noticed the gathering dark clouds. Just as they sought shelter, a flash of blinding white lightning overwhelmed them. The electricity only lasted a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Sean had gotten the worst of it. Smoke poured off of his body. His hair was singed off, and he laid completely still. Though Michael was injured, he carried his unconscious brother back to safety, but the devastation was far from over. Sean didn't wake up for 6 more months and suffered third-degree burns. Tragically, in 1989, over a decade later, he committed suicide. But the McQuillans weren't the only victims that day. The same bolt struck several other hikers, leaving several injured and one dead. The photograph of the smiling boys served as a warning of the dangers of lightning and a reminder that Mother Nature's ways are unpredictable and often deadly. The only place for women deemed hysterical or insane in the early 20th century was in a mental institution, which is where 35-year-old Katharina DeUTSL ended up in 1907 after allegedly sabotaging a railway during a political protest. Like many of the women in the Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic, Katharina had a passion for art, but her creative efforts were restricted to areas such as handcrafting or sewing. Katharina saw her limitations as an opportunity to both vent her creative frustrations and make a cathartic companion. Katharina constructed a life-sized figure from straw and mattress ticking and called it her husband. She would beat at it violently when angry and dance with it during her happier moments. And unfortunately for Katharina, her happier moments were few and far between. In 1941, during World War II, she was one of 70,000 victims murdered in the Nazi euthanasia program, stealing away any hope of her living a life beyond asylum walls. But before her death, Katharina managed to write a play, made plans to establish a home for children, and protested against unfair inmate treatment. Hans Prinzhorn, a junior doctor and art historian, took notice of Katharina and all the other patients' talented artwork, collecting thousands of various drawings, wood carvings, and textile works, allowing Katharina to live on in her creativity rather than her madness or her murder. When a heavy mist settled over the Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge in central China, a newspaper photographer stared in awe at the illusion it created, a bridge disappearing into nothingness. Wanting to capture the surreal image, he pulled out his camera and snapped photo after photo, but he failed to notice the couple dressed in black climbing over the guardrails of the bridge. He never saw the man jump. Mesmerized by the fog and adjusting his camera's settings, the photographer didn't notice he captured a series of images showing the man falling 13 stories to the icy waters below. Only when a bystander shouted that someone had leapt off the bridge did he realize what happened. Just then, a woman jumped in after the man, following her presumed boyfriend into the river in an apparent lover's suicide. After police arrived, they identified the male jumper from several of his possessions left on the bridge as 20-year-old Lu Han. The female jumper was never identified. It is unknown why the pair committed suicide, though the man's uncle claimed he'd been struggling to make a living and therefore struggling to settle down. The bodies were never found, but authorities found it highly unlikely that the pair survived the fall. Unfortunately, the bridge has earned the nickname Lover's Leap for its reputation as a popular place for couples to commit suicide with hopes of being together in death. The Beatles have been synonymous with the word sensation since they exploded onto the music scene in the 1960s. They performed sold-out arenas to roaring crowds of adoring fans and had an almost religious-like following. All the band's members were admired and adored on a global scale, including the co-founder of the band, John Lennon. John had a true passion for his music and a fire for political activism. He spent much of his life in the spotlight, to the point where strangers even approached him outside his New York apartment. On December 8, 1980, a seemingly innocent picture shows John signing an album for a fan named Mark David Chapman. What John didn't know was that Mark was carrying a gun, and he intended to use it by the night's end. He waited outside John's apartment reading Catcher in the Rye until John returned home after a long day of recording in the studio. This time there was no hesitation. Mark pulled out a revolver and landed 4 shots in John's left torso, killing him. During the investigation, police uncovered Mark's mental health issues. He claimed he heard voices and had obsessive thoughts about killing John after the musician declared that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Following John Lennon's death, activists and fans all over the world mourned the loss of their beloved artist. The last signed album was a coveted piece of memorabilia that was eventually bought by a Toronto curator who wanted to preserve a piece of tragic history. The album represented the true end of the Beatles, as they would never truly be the Beatles without Lennon. Not many people would die to save their life's work, but Robert Landsberg, an avid photographer, could count himself among the few. On the morning of May 18, 1980, Robert was snapping pictures of Mount St. Helens, documenting the changes in the volcano. He'd made a final trip to the base of the peak for one last round of photos for his collection. Then suddenly, everything erupted into chaos. Mount St. Helens exploded, releasing a towering cloud of ash into the sky. Instantly, Robert knew he couldn't outrun the deadly cloud and had no chance of survival. Instead of attempting a futile escape, Robert kept taking pictures of the eruption until the very last possible moment. The blast's high temperatures and ash caused abnormalities in the photos, scratches, warping, and light leaks, but the pictures became invaluable to geologists documenting the eruption. He then hastily rewound the film, stored it in his case, and shoved it inside his backpack, along with his wallet, perhaps knowing his body would be difficult to identify. With a quiet resignation, he laid himself over his backpack, shielding it from the ash, and awaited his imminent death. It wasn't until 17 days later that Robert's body was uncovered, and while he didn't survive, his backpack and footage did. Once developed, the photos were published in National Geographic, honoring the unending dedication to his work and the man whose passion had cost him his life. Marriage was a milestone 26-year-old Tina and her fiancé Gabe Watson were looking forward to. The couple, who'd met in college, planned to scuba dive at the Great Barrier Reef for their honeymoon. So, after they exchanged vows on October 11, 2003, the couple flew to Australia for their underwater adventures. But this honeymoon was far from a blissful escape. Just minutes after donning scuba gear and delving beneath the surface, Tina seemed panicked. Gabe claims he went to her aid when she accidentally knocked his mask loose. In the time it took for him to readjust his mask, Tina was already far out of his reach, sinking further into the depths of the ocean. A fellow diver, not yet realizing something was amiss, captured this picture. In the background, Tina lay on the ocean floor, losing oxygen and consciousness nearly 100 feet from the surface. Gabe went for help, the immense pressure in his ears preventing him from doing so himself. When Tina surfaced, a doctor attempted to revive her, but to no avail. Her death was classified as a drowning, but several other divers claimed Gabe was bear-hugging his flailing wife just before she began descending. Suspicious of the conflicting stories, the state coroner's office opened an investigation into Tina's death. Initially, Gabe pled guilty to manslaughter and was to serve a life sentence. Tina's father alleged that Gabe was after Tina's life insurance policy payout, but in February of 2012, Alabama authorities dismissed the case, citing a lack of evidence. Despite Gabe's strange behavior following Tina's death, dive experts believe it was a tragic accident that, because she was an inexperienced diver, the ocean currents caught her off guard and she panicked, depleting herself of oxygen and breathing in ocean water. Whether an accident or not, some of her final moments remain captured forever in the chilling underwater photo. Chris McCandless's wealthy Virginia family never dreamed he'd give up a materialistic and financially secure life for one of boundless travel and the solitude of wilderness. But that's exactly what the 24-year-old did. He severed family ties and donated $24,000 to charity before traveling across the United States, eventually hitchhiking his way to Alaska in April of 1992. This picture shows Christopher smiling in the Alaskan wilderness where he traversed an old mining road known as the Stampeded Trail, trying to live off of the land. But this would be his last happy photo. Chris was reckless in his endeavor and was unprepared to survive long term. He lived off of rabbits, squirrels, and birds and relied on roots and seeds to abate his hunger. He shrank from 140 pounds down to a skeletal 67 pounds, and 4 months into his excursion, he found himself in dire peril. On day 94 in his journal, he wrote, "Extremely weak, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy." Moose hunters stumbled upon Chris's body in an abandoned bus on September 6, 1992. A sign Chris had taped to the door desperately begged for help, saying he was injured and near death. Unfortunately, he starved to death before anyone found him. Chris's eccentric way of life was adapted by author John Krakauer into the novel titled Into the Wild, which rocketed Chris's life into the spotlight. Some saw him as inspirational, while others called him troubled and naive to the point of endangering himself. Regardless, his life and his death continue to fascinate those who encounter it, no matter how tragic. When salesman Travis Alexander met Jodi Arias during a conference in Las Vegas in the summer of 2006, he had no idea the destruction she would rain upon his life. It started off as friendship, but over time, Jodi grew infatuated with Travis. She converted to his Mormon religion just months after meeting him, and the two began a long-distance relationship in February of 2007. But after just a few months, Travis broke things off, claiming the relationship had been purely physical for him. Enraged by his unwillingness to commit, Jodi harassed and stalked Travis over the next year, hacking his Facebook account and slashing his tires. But despite this, the pair secretly continued having sex in the year following their breakup. In mid-2008, the two met up at Travis's home in Mesa, Arizona, and after having sex, Jodi began taking pictures of Travis in the shower. This photo was the last picture taken of Travis alive. On June 9, 2008, Travis's friends drop in to check on him, only to find his dead body in the shower. He'd been stabbed over 25 times, had his throat slit, a gunshot wound at his temple, and had defensive cuts and bruises all up and down his arms. Jodi became a suspect after police learned she'd been harassing her ex-boyfriend, and when first questioned, she claimed she hadn't seen Travis since April. When authorities uncovered DNA evidence tracing her to the crime scene, she confessed, saying she'd killed Travis in self-defense. Police were highly skeptical of this due to the number and nature of Travis's fatal injuries. Jodi was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place over the course of the next 7 years, and ultimately, the jury convicted Jodi, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole. They believe that when Travis refused to make things exclusive, her rage fueled her to commit murder, believing that if she couldn't have him, no one could. The waterfall along Montecito's Cold Spring Trail was a sight worth seeing if you could safely reach it. The path was dangerous, with steep, rocky drop-offs that required careful maneuvering by even the most experienced hiker. On March 16, 2014, 22-year-old Sailor Williams and her longtime friend Brendan Vega ventured out to the waterfall, neglecting to notice the setting sun. Before they knew it, the night plunged them into darkness. 2.5 miles away from the trailhead, Sailor and Brendan tried illuminating the path with their cell phone lights, but it wasn't enough to guide them safely. The pair fell several times, Brendan breaking his glasses and his elbow, Sailor breaking her arm and both ankles. Their shouts went unheard all night. In the morning, Brendan left Sailor to find help. As the day passed, Sailor began losing consciousness, so she was barely awake when a group of hikers happened by. They caught this picture of their friend, completely unaware of Sailor lying in the background, nearing death with each passing minute. When the hikers noticed her, they immediately called 911. Sailor was airlifted to a hospital where she needed multiple surgeries but survived. Brendan wasn't so lucky. That same day, another group of hikers happened upon Brendan's body. He'd fallen off a rocky ledge into an embankment while trying to retrieve help for his close friend and had perished from his injuries. Sailor was devastated by the loss, but both she and her mother agreed he died a true hero, trying to save the life of his best friend and tragically losing his own in the process. In the decades prior to the turn of the new millennium, there was a rise in religious cults. One of the most famous was the following of Heaven's Gate, that had its humble beginnings in the 1970s and its notorious gruesome end in 1997. Led by co-founders Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, Heaven's Gate preached a lifestyle of asceticism, foregoing earthly pleasures in order to obtain spiritual enlightenment. Marshall and Bonnie, who renounced their human names and became known as Doe and Ty, preached to their followers that Earth would be wiped clean to begin anew, and that the only method to escape this extermination was to voluntarily take their own lives. On March 26, 1997, this picture was taken at the Heaven's Gate cult home. It shows 4 cult members not sleeping, but dead in their beds. A total of 39 followers of Heaven's Gate committed mass suicide that day, with each member wearing dark clothing and the same Nike shoes. They ingested poison before tying plastic bags over their heads, suffocating themselves to death. They planned the suicide to jump on board a spacecraft they believed would carry their souls into the afterlife. Only one member of the cult survived, as he'd been chosen to stay on Earth to continue the teachings of Heaven's Gate. And nearly 2 decades after the mass suicide, and almost 4 decades since the cult's founding, the cult's official website is still being maintained, leading many to believe there are still silent followers out there. That's all for this episode. Now be sure to watch my other videos by pressing on screen here, and of course don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more by pressing here. And I'll see you next time.